Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to the Better Managers Briefing. I'm Ann Francke, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, and every Friday at this time, we try to bring you news that you can use to help you cope better through these very trying times. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome CMI Gold Medal winner, Sir Charlie Mayfield. He will be known to many of you as the former chairman of John Lewis, but he has also had a lifelong interest in and passion for skills. He currently chairs both Be the Business and QA, the UK's largest training provider. Can we call you Charlie?
You definitely can, Anne. Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you. Of course, welcome, Sir Charlie, and now we'll call you Charlie.
Well, no, thank you. That's fine. Charlie's just fine.
Great. So we will be taking questions later in the broadcast, but just to get us started, we're in week 5 of the lockdown, and I'm sure I'd be interested, and others would be, to get your overall assessment of, how are we coping? How well are we managing this crisis in your view?
So look, I mean, I think for all of us, the world sort of turned upside down about 5 or 6 weeks ago, and the initial period for people is one of some shock. Actually, they can't quite believe what's happening. I think we've moved through that initial period of shock into something where we understand this is going to be some semblance of a new normal, and businesses are adjusting accordingly. The work I do with Be the Business, which is really a movement that sort of supports small and medium-sized businesses, has just done some really interesting work, just talking to about 500 businesses across the country. And essentially what we found is they sort of fall into 4 segments. I mean, there's businesses who are sort of hibernating. They literally, their businesses just dried up and they've cut all their costs and they're just hibernating to try and get through this. There's businesses who are sort of surviving, and they may have faced a 70% fall in revenue, but they're keeping going with the 30%. They're obviously reducing costs and they're trying to keep things going as much as they can. You've then got pivoters, really interesting group. I mean, these are companies that have sort of realized that the business they were in isn't sort of working quite the same way anymore, and they've pivoted into something else. And we've got quite a few interesting examples where that's happened, and actually there's been a bit of a flourishing of innovation and sort of entrepreneurship coming through. And then you've got a few businesses that are sort of thriving. I mean, if you're in the PPE market right now, then you're clearly hugely in demand, but there's obviously not so many of those. So I think you've got a whole variety of responses. But initially, I guess everybody goes into that state of, crikey, how can I survive? What are my cash flows like, and what is liquidity like? What we're actually seeing is that people are coming through that bit reasonably on the whole so far, but I think a lot of it is about deferring liabilities rather than actually facing into them fully.
Sure, and taking advantage of all the government schemes to help with that, like the furlough scheme, etc. But it is interesting that you mentioned that some businesses are pivoting, and we'll come on to talk about those innovators and thrivers a bit later, but maybe focusing on the ones that are in the first half of the segments you described that have maybe laid off huge numbers of staff. Those managers and leaders, they're at home, and I know you advocate using the time, if you are at home and less busy, to learn. And what advice would you give managers and leaders that find themselves in this position? How can they best develop their skills?
So I think the first thing to perhaps recognize is that we're used to sort of being in control. And as managers and leaders, it's our sort of stock in trade to sort of be in control and to be sort of directing things and being sort of somewhat trying to be sort of in control of our destiny and what we're doing, and indeed directing the efforts of the companies that we and the people in the companies that we're leading. What's happened is that we've been sort of something bigger outside of our control has happened, which has really compromised our ability to push forward with our plans. And so, of course, the first order has to be to deal with that. And this is why resilience is so important. It's why really thinking hard about your cash flows and your cash scenarios is so important. But then beyond that, I think it's actually valuable to consider how this situation is impacting on all of the people individually. And while we can't magic our way back to the old normal and just get back to work, there are things you can do in a period of enforced furlough or enforced sort of disruption. And one of the things you can actually do is you can think about your business a bit more. One of the big challenges for a lot of leaders is they're so that they spend so much of their time working in the business that they don't actually have the distance to work sort of on it. And this is a great opportunity to reflect and to use the time to think more broadly and differently about where your business is, would be point one. I think secondly, training. This is actually a time to train. I mean, there's new things that any of us can learn. You mentioned, I think at the beginning, I chair QA, which is the largest UK IT and tech training provider. And we've got a fantastic suite of online tools. In fact, 95% of the course content is now available virtually. And I've decided that I want to actually brush up on I understand a bit about technology, but I'm not a techie. So I'm in fact doing a Cloud Academy program on cloud computing. So I understand more than just having a basic superficial knowledge of it. So there's things that we can all learn. It might be starting that professional qualification you never had time for. It could be brushing up on your Excel skills. I mean, I've been talking to my daughters about that, and there's things
trying to get them to do that.
Yeah. So there's things you can do, and I think it's useful. It's useful for the future, for everybody individually, and for companies if they use this time well. But it's also purposeful at a time when there's a big disruption, which is creating uncertainty.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned digital skills, and indeed, brushing up on your management and leadership skills. I know that, we have many free materials that we're making available on CMI. And I know we actually do work with QA on things like management and leadership apprenticeships and doing those assessments. Specifically, there were quite a number of apprentices that were approaching their endpoint assessment and now find that delayed. Although actually they can do it during their furlough. That's our understanding. But what advice would you give for people that suddenly they were nearing the end of a qualification, but suddenly they can't complete it, which also, of course, applies to all the NHS workers and key workers?
Well, the keep training is the main message. And I think in the initial response, some of the government guidance was a little bit ambiguous about this. It was sort of, I think, saying, look, if you're in a crisis, if you're in the NHS and you need to have all hands on the front line, then clearly that's a higher priority than training. Or it may be for some people. So businesses should have the potential to stop training. Actually, that advice has been changed, which I think is very helpful, to say wherever possible, you should keep on training. And a lot of providers, QA is one of them, have pivoted their business model so that actually we're doing a pretty good job of offering people virtual support, including endpoint assessments, and being able to carry on. So in some ways, get it done. This is a great time to get that training done and complete it.
Well, and of course, the learnings that people are going through on the front line are learning how to manage in a crisis and under incredibly challenging conditions, and of course, should form part of their assessments. But for those key workers that maybe weren't in training, there are businesses that are thriving or innovating, and suddenly people are having to step up and lead teams without having any experience of having done so before. And what advice would you give to them?
So, first of all, I think one of the fallacies of conventional thinking about leadership is the leaders know all the answers, and somehow, whenever there's a question, they have the answer to it immediately at their hands. This is a time of great uncertainty, and you know what? Communication is really important, and honesty within that communication is incredibly important. And so, honestly, I think you have to level with people that you don't know all the answers. You have to level with people about how serious this could be. I've never known a situation where if you treat people as adults, they behave as adults. They're very capable, and yet sometimes I think there's an inclination for management teams to want to protect people from bad news. It doesn't work, and I think it particularly is dangerous in this situation when there's so much uncertainty, and clearly we're so unable to do that. So I think that would be the first thing. I think within it, it's beneficial, I think, to talk about scenarios. It's beneficial to say to people, look, I don't know what the answers are. We can't predict the future. But what we have done is modeled this scenario, we've modeled that scenario. In the worst case, it could look as bad as this, but equally it might be better than that, and it might be here. And it just invites people into the uncertainty and helps them to understand it better, which is, it's not ideal, but it's better than being completely uninformed. And I think some of that is hugely important.
Mhm.
My other point would be to recognise the mental effects that that are happening to people right now as they're thrown out of control and their normal routines are disrupted. And you're going to have a whole range of people in your workforces who are affected very differently by this. I mean, for some people who might have certain domestic circumstances, may be finding this is actually okay. There'll be other people who are probably finding this is an extremely stressful time. They may be, they may have relied on the workplace as their primary source of engagement, of fulfillment, of recognition that they get from colleagues and people, and they're suddenly, removed from that, and it's incredibly difficult. So
Yeah, we
really
found
pay attention to that.
we did find, we just did a major piece of research at CMI, and we found that actually almost 60% of people are having issues with mental health in this crisis. It's an incredibly important point, and especially if they're caring, because so many people are juggling caring responsibilities, which is absolutely key. So cutting those people some slack, as you say, and realizing that you won't be in control, and checking in maybe, and being a support to colleagues is very important. Now, you mentioned you're learning some cloud computing, and obviously there is a seismic shift to digital and indeed to remote working. Do you think, how much of that do you think will remain going forward, and how do you think our concepts of learning and flexible working might change as we emerge from this crisis?
So, I mean, there's a lot of speculation about this going on right now, and there are some people who say the world will never be the same again, and it's going to be a complete change, and there's others who say it won't change that much. My own view is that the reality will fall somewhere between the two. I do think this will accelerate a number of existing trends, and in some cases quite dramatically. I mean, there's some retail trends I think will be definitely accelerated by this. In the learning space, again, from my experience at QA, we've pivoted to have 95% of our content is now available online. Before the crisis, quite a lot of our training was actually delivered physically in classrooms and through what people would recognize as conventional training. Very effective, particularly if you want to train someone to be a Python coder or C# or Agile, etc. And it's got a place, and it is sort of in some ways the gold standard because you get the interaction with the trainer. But what we're finding is, of course, our trainers are now having to learn how to do this virtually, and of course, the more they do it, the better they get, and they discover new opportunities and different ways to engage that actually have merit to them. And so, my view is that in the world of training, this will be a big point of inflection where people do embrace virtual training more. I actually think, and we've done some research actually within QA, which suggests that that what will come out of it is not just virtual. It definitely won't be just classroom. It will definitely be a blend of the two, and because people recognise the need for that, and in order to deliver that well, our view is that companies like ours again we are developing different tools for engagement. It's not just a question of giving people content, telling them the stuff, going through the curriculum. It's actually, if they're not physically in the classroom with you, then you have to replace some of the engagement they would have had through different means, and we're working on that. And actually, there's some pretty exciting stuff happening, which we think is going to be great for us in the future.
Yes, and most people do agree that this will change and that we all will become more digital and more used to working digitally and used to working remotely. And we know that actually about 2/3 of our surveyed folks said the same thing. They said that they felt that the digital practices would remain after the crisis. Of course, as you say, getting the engagement digitally is not as straightforward, and we'll have to investigate and innovate, and maybe this crisis will help with that. But of course, a lot of what we've been talking about is when we return to normal. So when we start to recover. But of course, that normal may very well be different. You've alluded to that. How do you think normal will differ, and how do you think managers and leaders and their companies should best prepare for this? What advice would you give?
So, first of all, I think anybody who's continuing to think that this is a short-lived issue and somehow lockdown is going to be lifted and we go back to normal, in whatever that normal is, needs to take a reality check that that is not going to happen. And therefore, while things will change in terms of the level of restrictions and social distancing, we're going to be living with significant restrictions, I think, for a long period of time. I'm not a scientist, but just listening to what's being said and the messaging that's coming through, I think that seems very, very likely. And therefore, I think for leaders, you need to embrace that reality. And in some ways, I mean, if I ask people, look, 8 weeks ago, could you imagine where we are today? People would have said no, they couldn't. So almost first of all take that sort of experience and the fact that we have managed to keep things going. Many businesses have done. They are continuing to trade, albeit restricted. You have found new ways of working. Rather than thinking that that's just a temporary thing and you're going to snap back to some kind of normal, what about trying to extrapolate forward? Put yourself, where you could be in 2 months' time or in 6 months' time, and imagine that the world is changed again in ways that you can't quite figure. What possibilities? What are the things you could do? And actually, when you engage creatively in those kind of things, you can find a lot of possibilities. There's probably things you could start testing today that you don't know are going to be fully utilized or fully beneficial tomorrow, but just the very act of starting to do that will position your business in a better position for that future. And I think you can see that. You can see businesses adapting pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Remember too that these times of crisis are often when people sow the seeds of the future, and so this is a time to be looking actively to find opportunity in crisis. And I think some of the best businesses and the ones that thrive in the future will be the ones who take decisions now and they take the opportunity to do things. One of the things that's happening is, whereas things used to take months, people are doing them in about a week. That's actually quite exciting. They won't do it perfectly, so they make mistakes. But we all moan about how long it takes to get change to happen. So let's take the opportunity of now to drive that hard.
Absolutely. And a couple of weeks ago, I spoke with Bruce Carnegie Brown, who's obviously my chairman and chair of Lloyd's and vice chair of Santander. And he was saying that the regulatory framework, the reduction in regulations that has occurred in a number of sectors, has been fantastic because people just need to get stuff through. And so he's starting to say, well, if we can do this now, why can't we do it in the future, right, as part of everyday business? So finding those faster ways of doing things is something that hopefully will stay with us. But of course, we are going to have to emerge from this, and everybody, including the government and employers, is going to have to play their part. And what I think, don't want, and you've argued very persuasively for this, is the situation we faced in 2008, where because of economic hardship, we emerged from the financial crisis not investing in skills. So how do we keep innovation and investment going in this what is undoubtedly an economically tough time?
So first of all, I think people will have to, if they're conscious of the fact that they have a choice. You could react to the situation in a number of ways, but let's just pick two. You could, on the one hand, you say, this has been an unbelievably distressing event that has absolutely poleaxed my business. And so I'm now going to become incredibly risk averse, and I'm going to hunker down, and I'm going to try and avoid spending any money. I'm going to cut back on any kind of investment in the future. It's just about survival and hunkering down. It's not a bad choice if that's the position that your business forces you to be in. But there is equally another choice, which is to say this is a time of opportunity. This disruption is a time when there are possibilities. If you, as you said, where Bruce was talking about the relaxation of some of the regulations, if you lift your eyes up and you look at what's going on, you look at some of the trends, you embrace the fact that some of the trends that you've probably been grappling with, a lot of businesses are being disrupted. They were before COVID. The trends that were disrupting them are probably going to get greater. Rather than just trying to continue to defend and sort of try and claw your way back to the old plan, one of the cathartic things of now is to say that old plan is dead, it's gone. So let's now really invest in developing the new, and let's look at where and how we can push that on. And in that respect, almost certainly training and skills will be even more important. I mean, there's some research done recently which showed that it was a forecast for 2030, which suggested that as many as 90% of the working population will have some kind of digital skills gap by 2030. That is a terrifying statistic, and it's one that you just can't allow to happen. And any business person, there will be a gap in your business that you need to fill. The other thing I'd say is that I think there will be a greater expectation on businesses to play a really important role in the recovery. It's not just going to be about getting your P&L back in shape, getting your profits back to where they were. This is the government and other people have provided resources which businesses have taken in their times of trouble. And I think there will be an expectation that there is some kind of payback, and that expectation will come politically, of course, probably come from the media. But I think it'll come from people in the businesses themselves where, look, this has been a tough time, and I'm sort of now even more interested in how I can play a part, and indeed how my employer is going to help me to play a part. And of course, skills and training and developing yourself with a view to helping your company to be more successful is a wonderful marriage of the individual interest with that of the company and ultimately of society. So it's something that I think is a very high priority and is much needed.
I certainly agree with you there, and I'm sure many companies reputationally are trying to take on that social responsibility and take it seriously. And we've seen that in the survey we did, where actually most businesses are stepping up, and that's heartening, and long may it continue as we come out of this crisis. Well, we've got a lot of questions, so I want to give the audience time to ask them. The first question is from David. He says, I'm currently furloughed and I'm just entering the latter part of my career, and I feel I could use the time to develop my social media skills. Any tips on where to start?
So, I mean, if there will be quite a lot of resources around which will help you to develop your skills like social media skills. And in fact, one of the things that that we're exploring, not just with QA but with the wider technology industry, is actually what more could we do to make available specific training that's more accessible to people. As an example, I mean, just beyond social media, right now, or just before the crisis, there were 50,000 vacancies for DevOps, software development, and cloud computing. The starting salaries for those jobs range between £35,000 and £45,000, and you've got businesses out there that can't fill those vacancies. So, there are approaches to training. We have one, we called it a boot camp. It's like an academy where in 12 weeks you can take someone who's got some basically good aptitude, they're logical, they're reasonably numerate, and you can turn them into somebody who's proficient at coding within 12 weeks. And I think we need solutions like that on a much bigger scale. And for people like David, you need some training opportunities where people can say, right, I've got a month or so, and I'm going to commit to doing something which is specific. Great if the employer can encourage that and direct some of it. And I think some of the guidance from the government has clarified that if you're on furlough, you can train. It's okay. You can train. It's not like you're going to fall foul of those rules.
No,
so get out there. I'd say to David, see what you can find. Find the best thing you can get, and then crack on with it.
Absolutely. And when it comes to those social media skills, if you have kids, David, now would be the time to do some reverse mentoring, right? Anyway, a question from Amy. Managing a remote and dispersed team isn't a new thing, but by being forced by it in this crisis, it's highlighting skills gaps. In your view, what skills are critical right now? So this would be for managing remote teams.
So, if you think about this when you're physically in an office space or you're seeing people directly, you will naturally, or as a manager, hopefully most people will, good managers at least, will naturally notice when somebody's having a good day or a bad day, whether they've reacted well or poorly to a certain situation, and you'll quite naturally respond to that in the way you go about leading that team. In a remote setting, it's harder to do that, because however good video conferencing may be, there's a lot that you miss in terms of the actually the verbal, the physical communication cues that you can get. So I don't think I have a magic answer to how you go about doing it. I think it's much more about being aware of the limitations and the distance. You know, I think of course, you know, everybody's having pub quizzes and, you know, doing stuff like that, which is good. I mean, good things to do, but equally probably not a substitute for picking up the phone to somebody and saying, how are you? How's it going? Actually, do you know what? Is it really tough being at home when you've got your kids screaming and it's really difficult for you to separate work and home? Are you getting a balance between work and home? Because, you know, you've got this sort of whole sense that you should be at work for hours and hours and hours, and you've always got to be there ready just in case a phone call comes through. You know, so I think there's no. I don't think it's rocket science, but I think it's about being conscious of the limitations and paying attention to people. That's probably the most important thing. You'll probably get it all right after that.
Absolutely. Managing with empathy is incredibly important right now, and paying close attention to the well-being of the people you manage. And as you say, asking them, how are you really? What are you doing to look after yourself? Well, we have a question from Ormond. He says, in spite of all our business continuity plans, this crisis seems to have caught most leaders off guard. Is this as a result of success making us complacent, poor leadership, or inadequate business continuity plans? There's a question.
Good question. So look, I think this scenario was probably, I think it's fair to say it's a pretty hard one to anticipate fully. Although there are people who have been saying it. Apparently, there's a famous Bill Gates TED talk where he's talking about exactly this kind of thing a few years back. So it's not you know, without any kind of forewarning. But I do think there's probably not been enough attention paid to resilience and to really thinking those things through. I think sometimes there's also a tendency for a bit of fatigue to set in around risk management. You know, risk management has become a bigger and bigger part of the management toolkit. You know, any company will have its risk register and its mapping and it's all the rest of it and the mitigation plans. And I've always felt personally that those are very good things. But in a way, what can happen is you can feel you've done it when you've sort of done the exercise of filling in the form. When actually, as a business leader, you need to step back. It's my point about working in versus on. You could work in doing the risk mapping, or you could step back and think about it and say, you know what is my instinct telling me? What is my, you know, where are the greatest risks? And do I feel satisfied that we've probably got them handled or not? And giving yourself some time. And again, this is perhaps an opportunity to think about that. I do think going forward that resilience is going to be a bigger deal. I mean, if you look at post 2008, the fact is the banks are in a far stronger position. You know, their balance sheets are much stronger. So we haven't seen a banking crisis following on from the COVID crisis. The rest of the economy probably didn't take the kind of measures that were required of banks. And my suspicion is that going forward, there will be a switch to saying you've got to build in more resilience. My former business, John Lewis, you know, we were very, very focused on the risks around a Brexit. And actually, we consciously spent the last 5 years building up liquidity. It wasn't in anticipation of the pandemic, but I'm damn sure it's helping right now because it means you've got buffer.
Absolutely. And businesses will go for more of a buffer also in their supply chains. I think the other message we've received is, you know, managing everything to just in time doesn't create the kind of buffer or resilience that you need. So here's a question from Ian. Self-awareness is critical for our leaders. How do you recommend encouraging greater transparency and courage to share their failures? How can we turn analysis into action, or perhaps learning from those failures?
So I think there's quite a lot in that. You know, I think perhaps it starts from accepting or embracing the fact that as a leader, you don't have to know all the answers. I remember very early in my career when I did a stint in consulting and being basically told by someone older and wiser than me that sometimes the best answer to a question is, you know what, that's a really great question. I don't know the answer to it, and therefore I'm going to take the time to figure it out before I come back to you. And so I think just allowing yourself not to feel like you have to have all the answers to everything is perhaps one of the ways to open the door to then, you know, being more self-aware, being more open, listening better, all of those things. And I think that there's a real appetite for people to be candid with. I mean, right now, you look at what's happening publicly with the government and how some of the media is dealing with the crisis. There is I think there's actually a recognition across the whole country that this is a really difficult situation, and quite a lot of sympathy for that. But I think you can put yourself into a worse position by sort of pretending or saying things with certainty rather than reflecting the level of uncertainty and inviting and encouraging people to join you in that uncertainty, recognizing that you've got to make decisions and you've got to do the best you can. I think just if you can open your way to that, it's a good starting point at the very least.
Absolutely, and I think we're seeing a little bit more openness in admitting that government, for example, is saying maybe we don't have all the answers, and maybe we do need to do some more learning. So our last question is from Ibrahim, and he's saying, for you, what is Agile in action? So maybe an example.
Gosh. Well, so look, if I think about that from a QA perspective, or actually from a Be the Business perspective, Agile in action is, in Be the Business, it's a movement that's supporting small and medium-sized enterprises in terms of competitiveness and growth. We've got loads of tools, we're doing lots of great stuff, but actually, when this COVID crisis happened, there's no point carrying on talking to people about the fact that we've got this wonderful mentoring scheme. And by the way, it's actually highly relevant even now, in fact, even more so. You've got to pivot to what people are really concerned with. And so we actually turned the whole team to saying, let's start talking about what is going on. Let's recognize that businesses are facing some challenges. Let's recognize that those business leaders themselves will value hearing what other people are doing. And so we pivoted the whole site, in fact, to talking about giving examples, really short 2-minute, 3-minute videos about how somebody's done their cash flow management, how someone's thought about communication to their staff, how someone has pivoted their business, so that you're just creating a bit of a community. And so that was, I think, an Agile response to that. On the QA front, again, as I said, we've got 95% of the content now online or in virtual form. And we did that. The guys did that in literally weeks. And the great thing about this situation is if we hadn't had the crisis, we were always wanting to do that, but we probably would have taken months. And we've done it in weeks. And of course, it's not perfect, and we'll keep on learning all the time. But we've made a bold step. Absolutely.
It's a great start. And indeed, we too have gone virtual much faster than I ever would have hoped for. And that's actually a great example that many other businesses have as well. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your wisdom. There's loads of great advice in there, and we will be sharing that this webinar, but we will also be writing it up and sharing it in that way. And it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. And stay safe and stay in virtual touch.
Stay safe and stay well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.